My name is Sarah Mitchell, and at 38 years old, I learned that a perfect life can be obliterated in the time it takes for a traffic light to change from green to red. It was a Tuesday, an ordinary, beautiful Tuesday. David kissed me goodbye that morning, his breath still smelling of the coffee we'd shared on the sun-drenched patio of our home. "Don't work too hard," he'd said, his hand lingering on my cheek. He was a partner at a prestigious architecture firm, and I ran my own interior design studio. We were a team, in life and in work. Our home was a testament to that, a blend of his clean structural lines and my love for warm textured spaces. We had built this life together, brick by brick, dream by dream. It was a life I loved with a fierceness that sometimes startled me. "I'll be home by 7, he promised, his voice a familiar anchor. "We'll finally open that bottle of wine from Tuscany." We'd been saving it for a non-special occasion, a quiet Tuesday being the most special occasion of all. I watched his car disappear down the tree-lined street, never once imagining it would be the last time. The phone call came at 3:17 p.m. I was selecting fabric swatches for a client's lakeside cottage, the afternoon sun pouring into my studio. The hospital's number flashed on my screen, and my world, so meticulously designed and cared for, imploded. A car accident. A truck that ran a red light. Instantaneous, they said. He wouldn't have felt a thing. The words were like stones dropped into the still pond of my life, the ripples turning into tidal waves that washed everything familiar away. The days that followed were a blur of numb arrangements and suffocating condolences. Our friends, our families, they moved around me like ghosts. I moved through our house, my house, like a stranger, touching his things, breathing in the fading scent of his cologne on a sweater left draped over a chair. The silence was a physical presence, heavy and accusing. Every room echoed with his absence. His drafting table in the study, littered with pencils and sketches. The garden he lovingly tended, his side of the bed cold and untouched. The funeral was a nightmare of muted colors and hollow words. David's older brother, Mark, gave the eulogy. His voice cracked with what sounded like genuine emotion as he spoke of David's brilliance, his kindness, his unwavering integrity. Mark's wife, Lisa, stood beside him, her arm linked tightly with his, her eyes constantly darting around the church, as if taking attendance. I remember thinking it was odd, how performative her grief seemed, but my own pain was so all-consuming that I dismissed it as a trick of my shattered nerves. It was a week later, in the sterile conference room of our family lawyer, Mr. Henderson, that the foundation of my reality was not just cracked, but shattered completely. The reading of the will was supposed to be a formality, a painful but straightforward step. David and I had drawn up our wills together 5 years ago, sitting right here at this same table. Everything to each other, simple. Clean. Just like us. It was a document, born of love and mutual respect, a final promise. Mr. Henderson adjusted his glasses, his expression grim. "Sarah," he began, his voice softer than usual, laden with a pity that made my stomach clench. "There's been a complication." Mark and Lisa were seated across the polished mahogany table from me. Mark, who usually met my gaze with brotherly affection, stared fixedly at a point on the wall behind me. Lisa, however, was leaning forward, her posture rigid, with an anticipation that felt entirely out of place. "What kind of complication?" I asked, my voice a dry whisper. The room felt airless. "David executed a new will 6 months ago," Mr. Henderson said, sliding a document across the table. "Without my counsel." I stared at the paper. It was unmistakably David's signature, the confident loop of the D, the sharp slash of the T. But the document itself felt alien, wrong. "That's impossible. He would have told me. We told each other everything. Our marriage was built on that very principle. There were no hidden credit cards, no secret lunches with exes, no unshared worries. We were a united front." "It appears he didn't," Lisa said, her voice sharp, cutting through the room's thick tension. "It's all quite clear." Mr. Henderson cleared his throat, uncomfortable. "The new will leaves the majority of his estate, 60%, including his share of the house and his life insurance policy, to a beneficiary named Emily Davis." The name meant nothing to me. It hung in the air, meaningless, and yet utterly terrifying. "Who is Emily Davis?" It was Mark who answered, pulling a folded, official-looking paper from his own briefcase. He unfolded it with a dramatic, deliberate slowness that made my skin crawl. It was a birth certificate. "Emily Davis," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial hush, as if he were sharing a sacred, painful truth, "is David's daughter." The room tilted, the air vanished from my lungs. Daughter? David and I had chosen not to have children. It was a decision we'd made together, early in our marriage, over long conversations that stretched into the night. We had our careers, our travels, our deep, abiding partnership. It was enough. It was everything. The idea that he had a child, a living, breathing piece of him somewhere in the world, was a concept so vast and shocking I couldn't contain it. "That's a lie," I managed to say, my hands trembling violently under the table where no one could see. I clasped them together, to keep them still. It's not, Lisa interjected, a strange, triumphant gleam in her eyes. It was a college fling, from his senior year. The mother, Clara Davis, never told him. She passed away last year from cancer, and Emily, now 18, reached out to David through social media. He was devastated, but he was also trying to find the right time to tell you, Sarah. He wanted to do right by his child. He wanted to provide for her. I looked at the birth certificate Mark pushed toward me. The name of the father, David Mitchell. The date, 18 years ago. A time when David was in his final year of college, full of ambition and the invincibility of youth. I knew his stories from that era. The all-nighters in the architecture lab, the fraternity parties, the carefree existence before the weight of adulthood settled on his shoulders. Could it be possible? Could a part of him, a secret, hidden part, have existed all these years without my knowledge? The doubt was a poison, seeping into the cracks of my grief. I felt the first, cold trickle of betrayal, mixed with the overwhelming sorrow. But beneath the shock and the heartbreak, something else stirred. A small, quiet, stubborn voice that knew my husband better than anyone ever had or would. The man I married was honest to a fault. He believed in facing problems head-on, in clear communication. He despised deception in any form. Hiding a child for 18 years? Keeping that secret after we'd promised each other a life of absolute transparency? It didn't sound like the David I knew. It sounded like the plot of a bad daytime drama. Yet, as I looked at Mark's satisfied expression and Lisa's poorly concealed smirk, the true horror began to dawn on me. This wasn't just about a secret daughter. This was about my home, my future, the life David and I had built with our own hands and hearts. The house wasn't just a structure. It was every memory we'd ever made. The life insurance was my security, the cushion that would allow me to grieve without the immediate panic of financial ruin. And the people sitting across from me, the ones who had broken bread at our table, who had celebrated holidays with us, were now calmly, methodically, trying to take it all away. They were family. And in that sterile lawyer's office, surrounded by the ghost of my husband's love, I realized I was utterly alone, and the war for everything I had left had just begun. The drive home from the lawyer's office was a blur of rain-streaked windows and the monotonous swish of the wipers. I couldn't feel my hands on the steering wheel. Mark's words, David's daughter, echoed in the silent car, a taunting refrain that made my head pound. Lisa had offered, in a voice dripping with false concern, to drive me home. "You're in no state, Sarah," she'd said, her hand on my arm, a gesture that felt more like a claim than a comfort. I had refused, with a curtness that surprised even me, needing the stark solitude of the car to try and piece my shattered thoughts together. I walked into our house, and the silence felt different now. It was no longer just filled with grief. It was pregnant with accusation, with the ghost of a secret I couldn't comprehend. I went straight to the large wooden chest where we kept our photo albums, a lifetime of memories meticulously documented. My hands trembled as I pulled out the album from David's college years. There he was, young and lanky, his arms slung around a group of friends. I scanned every face, every girl smiling beside him. Was one of them Clara Davis? Had he loved her? The photos offered no answers, only the smiling, carefree face of a man I realized I might not have known at all. The doubt was a corrosive acid. I thought of the times we'd discussed children. It had never been an argument, but a mutual understanding. "The world's a complicated place, Sal," he'd say, calling me by his pet name. "I'm happy just having you to come home to." Had that been a lie? A cover for a guilt he carried? I remembered a period, about 6 months ago, when he'd been unusually quiet, distracted. He'd claimed it was stress from a high-profile project at work. Had that been when Emily contacted him? The timeline fit, a fact that sent a fresh wave of nausea through me. The doorbell rang, shattering the oppressive silence. Through the peephole, I saw my best friend, Maya. Her face was etched with worry. Word, it seemed, traveled fast. She enveloped me in a hug the moment I opened the door. "I just heard," she whispered into my hair. "I came as soon as Lisa called me." I stiffened. "Lisa called you?" Maya pulled back, her brow furrowed. "Yeah, she said you'd had a shock at the lawyers, and that you shouldn't be alone." She sounded upset. Upset? A bitter laugh escaped my lips. That's one word for it. I led her to the kitchen, the heart of our home, where David and I had shared countless meals and conversations. Now it felt like a crime scene. I told her everything, the words tumbling out in a chaotic rush. The new will, Emily Davis, the birth certificate. Maya listened, her expression growing from shock to outright disbelief. "A daughter? David? Absolutely not," she said, her voice firm. "I've known David since you two started dating. That man couldn't keep a surprise birthday party secret for more than a day. A whole child? No way. But the will, Maya. His signature." "Something's not right," she insisted, leaning forward. "Think about it. Mark and Lisa, have you ever really trusted them? I hesitated. Mark was David's brother, but they had never been particularly close. Mark had always been envious of David's success, making backhanded comments about our house, our vacations. Lisa was a social climber, her affection conditional on what you could do for her. David had tolerated them for the sake of family, but he'd always maintained a polite distance. They're family, I said weakly, repeating the mantra that had been drilled into me. Family doesn't do this, Maya countered. Not like this. Springing this on you at the will reading? Where is this Emily? Why hasn't she reached out to you, the widow? It's all too neat. Too cruel. Her words were a lifeline, pulling me back from the edge of despair. She was right. The narrative was too perfect. The timing too convenient. A secret daughter appears just in time to disinherit the grieving widow, with the brother-in-law acting as the righteous messenger. Later that night, powered by a desperate need for answers, I did what I should have done immediately. I went into David's study. This was his sanctuary, a room filled with his blueprints, his books, his essence. I'd avoided it since his death, the pain too acute. But now, a new purpose pushed me forward. I started with his laptop. His password was our anniversary, a small, comforting consistency. I searched his email for Emily Davis, Clara Davis, any mention of a daughter. Nothing. I checked his social media messages. Again, nothing. If he had been communicating with a newfound child, he'd been extraordinarily careful to erase all traces. Then, my eyes fell on the bottom drawer of his desk, the one he always kept locked. He'd told me it held old, confidential client files. I'd never had a reason to look inside. Now I searched his keychain, finding a small, unmarked key. It fit. The drawer wasn't full of client files. It held a thick, leather-bound journal and a small, locked metal box. My heart hammered against my ribs as I opened the journal. It wasn't a diary of daily events, but a record of his thoughts, his worries. And on a page dated about 8 months ago, I found an entry that made my blood run cold. Mark approached me again today. The debts are worse than I thought. He's talking about losing his business, his house. Lisa is panicking. I've helped them before, but this is different. It's a bottomless pit. I told him this was the last time. He didn't take it well. Said I was turning my back on family. The guilt is heavy, but Sal and I have our own future to secure. I can't keep bailing him out. I fear this isn't over. I sat back, the journal slipping from my numb fingers. Mark was in serious financial trouble. David had refused to help him further. And now David was dead, and Mark was the bearer of a will that left him, through this Emily, a majority of David's estate. It wasn't proof, not yet, but it was a motive. A powerful, desperate motive. The metal box was harder to open. I ended up using a letter opener to pry it loose. Inside, there were no more journals. Instead, I found a single, folded piece of paper. It was a medical report from a urologist, dated over 10 years ago. At the top was David's name. My eyes scanned the clinical language, my breath catching in my throat as I reached the conclusion. The report detailed a severe case of mumps David had contracted in his early 20s, a rare complication of which had resulted in permanent, irreversible infertility. The doctor's note was unequivocal. The likelihood of him fathering a child was, for all intents and purposes, 0. The room spun. The birth certificate. The story of a college fling. It was all a lie. A monstrous, calculated lie built on the assumption that I wouldn't know, or that my grief would make me too weak to fight. The sorrow that had been my constant companion was suddenly eclipsed by a white-hot rage. They hadn't just tried to steal my home. They had tried to assassinate my husband's character, to tarnish the perfect love we had shared. They had used my grief as a weapon against me. Clutching the medical report, I looked at David's photograph on the desk. He was smiling, his eyes crinkling at the corners. He had known. He had known his brother's nature, and he had kept this medical report, this single piece of paper, like a shield to protect me. He had anticipated the storm, even if he couldn't prevent it. The war was no longer about inheritance. It was about truth, and I was ready to fight. The medical report felt like a live wire in my hands, humming with the power of absolute truth. The initial shock gave way to a cold, clear fury. Mark and Lisa hadn't just seen an opportunity in my grief. They had engineered it. This was premeditated. I carefully placed the report back in the metal box, my mind racing. I needed more than this single piece of paper. I needed an unassailable case. I started with what I knew, Mark's financial troubles. David's journal entry was my roadmap. The next morning, I called Maya. I need your help, I said, my voice steadier than it had been in weeks. I need to find out everything about Mark's business, Summit Contracting. Maya, a freelance journalist, had skills and sources I could only dream of. Consider it done, she said without hesitation. I'll dig into everything. Business filings, liens, court records. What are you thinking? I'm thinking David's refusal to be their ATM anymore was the catalyst for all of this, I replied, my gaze fixed on the garden David had loved. Desperate people do desperate things. While Maya worked her magic, I turned my attention to Lisa. I replayed the funeral in my mind, frame by frame. Her darting eyes. Her performative grief. It wasn't just odd. It was the behavior of someone watching a play they'd directed, anxious for it to unfold correctly. I remembered something else, a small detail that had seemed insignificant at the time. As I'd stood by the casket, utterly broken, Lisa had been standing near a group of David's colleagues. I'd glanced over, and for a split second, I saw her not crying but listening intently, a calculating look on her face. She was gauging the room, assessing the sympathies of the people who mattered. I needed a deeper look into their lives. I spent the day in David's study, a detective in my own home. I pulled out the photo albums again, but this time I was looking for Mark and Lisa. I found pictures from Christmases past, birthdays, summer barbecues. In every photo, Lisa's smile never quite reached her eyes when she looked at David and me. There was a hunger there, a resentment that I had been too content in my own life to notice. In one photo, from our housewarming party, she was staring at the large glass doors that led to the patio, her expression one of pure, unvarnished covetousness. The seed of this scheme, I realized, might have been planted years ago. David's college journals were my next stop. I read every entry from his senior year, the time of the alleged affair with Clara Davis. His writings were filled with the anxieties of final projects, excitement about job interviews, and anecdotes about his friends. There were a few mentions of casual dates, but no deep connection, no heartbreak, and crucially, no mention of anyone named Clara. The journal was a chronicle of a focused young man on the cusp of his career, not a secret father-to-be. It was another nail in the coffin of their lie. 2 days later, Maya came over, her laptop bag slung over her shoulder. Her expression was grim. "You were right," she said, opening her laptop on the kitchen island. "Summit Contracting is a house of cards. Mark has taken out massive loans against the business. There are 3 separate liens, filed by suppliers for non-payment. He's about 60 days away from bankruptcy." She showed me the documents. The numbers were staggering. "But it gets worse," she continued, pulling up another file. "This isn't just bad business. I have a source at the Atlantic City casino. Mark has a serious gambling problem. He's lost over $200,000 in the last year alone. That's where the money's gone." The pieces snapped into place with terrifying clarity. The gambling debts explained the desperation. The failing business provided the perfect cover. This wasn't just about maintaining a lifestyle. It was about survival and feeding an addiction. "We need more," I said, the coldness in my voice surprising me. "We need to know about Emily." "I know a guy," Maya said softly. "A private investigator. He's discreet, and he's good. His name is Frank." I didn't hesitate. "Set up a meeting." Frank Delaney was a man in his 50s, with a calm demeanor, and eyes that missed nothing. We met at a quiet coffee shop, away from my neighborhood. I laid it all out for him. The will, the alleged daughter, the medical report, Mark's debts. He listened intently, taking notes on a small pad. "The first step is to verify the existence of Emily Davis," he said in a low, even tone. "If she's a real person who believes David Mitchell is her father, that's one thing. If she's a fiction, that's another." Within 48 hours, Frank had answers. He came to my house this time, his expression unreadable. "Emily Davis is a real person," he began, and my heart sank for a terrifying second. But then he continued. "She's an 18-year-old community college student living in Ohio. Her mother, Clara, did pass away last year." "So it's true?" I whispered, feeling the ground give way again. "No," Frank said firmly. "I managed to get a copy of the original birth certificate from the county records office. The line for the father is blank. The one Mark showed you is a forgery, a very good one, but a forgery nonetheless. Furthermore, I spoke to Clara's sister. Clara never mentioned a David Mitchell. The father was a boyfriend who left town before Emily was born. She has no knowledge of any contact from your husband." The relief was so profound it left me lightheaded. Emily was an innocent pawn, her tragic story co-opted by Mark and Lisa for their scheme. They had probably found her through online obituaries, seeing a vulnerable young woman they could use. "There's more," Frank added. "I've been watching Mark and Lisa. They've been meeting with a man named Derek Sloan several times this week. He has a record for forgery and fraud. I believe he's the one who created the fake will and the altered birth certificate." He placed a few grainy photos on the table from a long lens camera. They showed Mark and Lisa in a diner booth with a shifty-looking man, exchanging an envelope. The plot was no longer a suspicion. It was a documented conspiracy. The grief that had once defined me was now a fuel. They had tried to weaponize my love for David against me. They had thought the quiet, grieving widow would be an easy target. But as I looked at the evidence spread across my kitchen table, the medical report, the financial records, the PI's photos, I felt a new version of myself emerging. I was no longer just Sarah, the widow. I was Sarah, the keeper of David's truth. And I was ready to expose their elaborate scheme to the light. Armed with Frank's findings, the battle shifted from emotional defense to cold, hard fact-checking. The private investigator's report was a powerful weapon, but I needed evidence that was irrefutable in a court of law. I needed to dismantle their forgeries piece by piece, to prove not just that they were lying, but exactly how they had constructed their elaborate deception. The medical report of David's infertility was my atomic bomb, but I needed to build the case for its detonation. I asked Mr. Henderson, my lawyer, for a certified copy of the contested will. When it arrived, I didn't just read it. I dissected it. I spread it out on David's large drafting table in his study, alongside copies of documents I knew were genuine. Our original joint will, several of David's signed business contracts, and even the deed to our house. At first glance, the signature on the new will was convincing. It had the same flow, the same general shape. But David's signature wasn't just a name. It was a habit, a physical memory. I remembered watching him sign documents, the quick, confident flourish. I got a magnifying glass from his desk drawer. The devil was in the details. In every authentic signature, the loop of the D in David was open and fluid. In the forged will, it was a closed, careful circle. The cross on the T in Mitchell, on the real documents, was a sharp, decisive slash. On the forgery, it was hesitant, with a tiny blob of ink at the beginning of the stroke, as if the forger had paused nervously before committing. It was a mimicry, not a replication. Next, I examined the dates. The will was dated 6 months ago. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my calendar to that period. David and I had been in Paris for a long weekend, a gift to ourselves for my birthday. I found a photo of us laughing in front of the Eiffel Tower, time-stamped on the exact date at the top of the will. It was impossible. There was no way David could have been in a lawyer's office in Boston, executing a will on the same day we were eating croissants in Montmartre. It was a sloppy, fatal mistake. They had chosen a random date, not realizing it was a date etched in my memory as one of pure happiness. But the most damning evidence was still the medical report. Frank's information about the mumps-induced infertility was crucial, but it was a diagnosis from over a decade ago. I needed something more contemporary, more surgical in its finality. And then I remembered the safety deposit box. David was a man who believed in preparation. We had a joint safety deposit box at our local bank, but he'd once mentioned, almost in passing, that he kept a separate one for legacy documents. At the time, I'd thought he meant old family photos, or his own father's will. Now, a new understanding dawned. I went to the bank, the same one where the manager had offered his condolences just weeks before. With the second key I'd found on David's keychain, I accessed the box. Inside, nestled beside our marriage certificate and the passports from our travels, was a slim folder. My hands were steady as I opened it. The top document was a medical report from 3 years ago. It detailed a vasectomy. David had undergone the procedure after we'd made our final, peaceful decision to remain child-free. The report included the urologist's confirmation of a successful procedure and the results of the follow-up tests that showed a 0 sperm count. It was dated, signed and stamped with the hospital's official seal. It was unimpeachable. Beneath it was a single sheet of stationery, filled with David's familiar handwriting. It was a letter, addressed to me. My dearest Sal, if you're reading this, then something has happened to me, and you've had to open this box. I hope with all my heart that you never do. That we grow old and gray together and laugh about my excessive caution. But if I am gone, and if Mark has caused you trouble, I want you to have this. My brother's heart is not entirely bad, but his judgment is easily clouded by desperation, especially where money is concerned. His gambling is a sickness, one he hides well. I've bailed him out more times than I can count, and each time, the resentment in his eyes grew, not gratitude. He came to me 6 months ago with a scheme that I shut down immediately. It involved falsifying documents. I fear that without me here to refuse him, he may turn that ingenuity toward you. I love you more than life itself. You are my entire world. The life we built together is our truth. Do not let anyone, especially not family, rewrite our story or steal your peace. Use these documents. Be strong. I am so sorry to have left you to face this. All my love forever, David. Tears streamed down my face, but they were not tears of weakness. They were tears of awe for the man I had married. He had seen the storm coming from miles away. He hadn't just loved me in the present. He had loved me enough to protect my future. The letter wasn't a prediction. It was a shield he had crafted for me with foresight and profound love. I took everything to Mr. Henderson. I showed him the discrepancies in the signatures, the impossible Paris date, the vasectomy records, and David's letter. The lawyer's professional demeanor cracked. He was visibly shocked. "This is extraordinary," he murmured, examining the vasectomy report. "Biologically impossible. This alone invalidates their entire claim." He looked at me with a new respect. "Sarah, this is more than enough to not only defeat their claim, but to press serious charges against them. Forgery, fraud, attempted theft." The elaborate nature of their scheme was now fully revealed. It wasn't just a greedy grab. It was a carefully plotted assassination of the truth. built on the assumption that I would be too grief-stricken to investigate. They had forged a will, fabricated a birth certificate, and invented an entire human tragedy, all to exploit my loss. But they had underestimated me. And they had profoundly underestimated the love David had for me. A love so strong it reached from beyond the grave to hand me the tools to destroy their lies. The paper trail was complete. Now, it was time for the confrontation. The conference room at Mr. Henderson's office felt like a courtroom. The air was cold and still, the large mahogany table, a glossy expanse separating the two sides of this war. On one side sat Mr. Henderson and I. On the other, Mark and Lisa would soon arrive. A small, high-quality digital recorder sat in the center of the table. Its red light, a tiny, unblinking eye. "Remember," Mr. Henderson said quietly, "let them talk. The evidence will do the work for you. Your only job is to stay calm." I nodded, my hands clasped tightly in my lap. I wasn't calm. A storm of anger, grief, and betrayal raged inside me, but I had learned to channel it into a cold, focused intensity. I was doing this for David. For our truth. The door opened, and Mark and Lisa walked in. Lisa was dressed for victory, in a sharp, expensive-looking suit, a triumphant smirk already playing on her lips. Mark looked less confident. His eyes were shifty, and he avoided looking directly at me. "Sarah, Mr. Henderson," Lisa began, taking a seat as if she owned the room. "I hope we can resolve this quickly and amicably for everyone's sake, especially for Emily's." "That's the plan," I said, my voice even. Mr. Henderson gestured to the recorder. "For the sake of transparency, and to ensure an accurate record of our discussion, we'll be recording this meeting. Do you consent?" Lisa waved a dismissive hand. "Fine, whatever." Mark just nodded stiffly. Once the recorder was on, and Mr. Henderson had stated the date and attendees, I began. I didn't look at Lisa. I fixed my gaze on Mark. He was the weaker link. "Mark," I started, "I want to give you one chance. Withdraw the claim to David's estate. Admit that the will and the story about Emily are fabrications, and we can end this now, without involving the police." Lisa laughed, a brittle, ugly sound. "Is that your strategy, Sarah? Empty threats? We have the will. We have the birth certificate. This is a waste of time." I ignored her, my eyes still locked on Mark. His Adam's apple bobbed nervously. "Mark?" I prompted. The documents are real, Sarah." He stammered. "David wanted to provide for his daughter. It's what any decent father would do." "Any decent father," I repeated softly. Then I opened the folder in front of me. I slid the first document across the table. It was a blown-up copy of the date on the forged will, alongside the photo of David and me in Paris on that exact same day. "Explain this, Mark. How was David signing a will in Boston when he was here?" I tapped the photo. "With me." Lisa's smirk faltered. Mark's face went pale. A mistake in the date. The lawyer's office must have typed it wrong." "A convenient mistake," Mr. Henderson commented dryly. I slid the next item across. The magnified signatures, the closed D and the forgery circled in red next to the open, fluid D and a genuine signature. And this? Did the lawyer also forget how David signed his name? "This is ridiculous," Lisa snapped. "You can't prove anything with this nitpicking." "Then let's move away from nitpicking," I said, my voice hardening. I slid the third document across the table. It was the vasectomy report. "This is David's medical record from 3 years ago. It confirms a successful vasectomy. The follow-up tests show a 0 sperm count. It was biologically impossible for David to father a child." The room went utterly silent. The color drained completely from Mark's face. Lisa stared at the document, her mouth a thin, hard line. "That's a lie," she finally hissed. "You forged that. It's from a safety deposit box only David and I had access to," I said calmly. "But we're not done." I looked at Mark, whose breathing had become shallow. "Frank Delaney, the private investigator I hired, has spoken to Claire Davis's sister. The real birth certificate for Emily Davis has the father's line blank. The one you have is a forgery, created by a man named Derek Sloan, who you've been meeting with regularly." I placed the grainy photos from the diner on the table. Mark put his head in his hands. A low moan escaped his lips. The dam was breaking. "We also have your financial records, Mark," I continued, relentless now. "Summit Contracting is drowning in debt. And the gambling, over $200,000 lost in Atlantic City last year. You weren't just trying to get what you thought you deserved. You were desperate." "Shut up, Mark," Lisa snarled, but it was too late. "He said no." Mark burst out, his voice cracking with a mixture of fear and long-suppressed rage. He looked up, his eyes wild, glaring at me as if I were David. "I went to him. I was going to lose everything. The house, the business, everything. And he said no. His own brother. He had all this." He gestured wildly, as if to encompass my entire life. "And he wouldn't help me." The confession hung in the air, stark and ugly. Lisa slumped back in her chair, defeated. So you decided to take it, I said, my voice cold as ice. You found a vulnerable girl who had lost her mother, and you built a lie around her. You paid a forger. You thought I would be too sad and too stupid to fight back. Mark dissolved into tears, sobbing uncontrollably. Lisa sat in stony silence, all her arrogance gone, replaced by a bitter resignation. The police, Mark choked out between sobs. Are you going to call the police? Mr. Henderson spoke. That is up to Sarah. Forgery and fraud of this magnitude are felonies. You could both see significant prison time. I looked at them, at the ruins of the family I had thought I had. I thought of David's letter, his love, his protection. I thought of Emily, an innocent girl used as a pawn. Here is what is going to happen, I said, my ultimatum clear and precise. You will sign a legally binding document, prepared by Mr. Henderson, admitting to the entire scheme and renouncing all claims to David's estate. You will then come with me to my parents' house, and you will tell them the truth, the whole truth. And if we do, Lisa asked, her voice hollow, then I will not press criminal charges, I said. But if you ever attempt to contact me again, or if a single word of this lie ever surfaces, I will not hesitate to take this entire folder to the district attorney. It was over. They had no fight left. They agreed to my terms. As they left the room, broken and ashamed, I felt no triumph, only a profound, weary sadness. The confrontation was over, but the emotional fallout was just beginning. The signed confession from Mark and Lisa sat on Mr. Henderson's desk, a stark, legal end to their cruel fiction. But in the real world, beyond the lawyer's office, the fallout was just beginning to spread, a toxic cloud of shame and disbelief that contaminated everything it touched. The legal proceedings were swift and merciless, but not in the way I had initially envisioned. I held true to my word. I did not press criminal charges. The signed affidavit, in which they detailed their entire scheme, from the gambling debts to hiring the forger Derek Sloan, was enough of a sword of Damocles hanging over them. Mr. Henderson structured it as a legally binding agreement, their silence and compliance in exchange for my restraint. Any breach would result in immediate criminal prosecution. It was a cold peace, but it was peace. The true battle was fought in the hearts of our family. The meeting at my parents' house was one of the most painful experiences of my life. My mother, upon hearing the truth from Mark's own trembling lips, burst into tears, not of sympathy for him, but of sheer devastation. My boys, she kept whispering. What happened to my boys? The perfect family image she had clung to for decades was shattered beyond repair. My father, a quiet man, turned a frightening shade of red, his disappointment, a silent, thunderous force in the room. He didn't yell. He simply looked at Mark with an expression of such profound loss that it was worse than any anger. The family divisions were immediate and brutal. Aunts, uncles, and cousins chose sides. Some, horrified by Mark's actions, rallied around my parents and me. Others, however, surprisingly blamed me. You should have just given them some money, Sarah, one aunt said to me over the phone. You've driven a permanent wedge in this family. Was the house really worth that? The accusation took my breath away. I hadn't driven the wedge. Mark and Lisa had wielded the axe. But I was the one who had refused to let the wound close over, without removing the poisonous splinter first. In the weeks that followed, my grief for David became intertwined with a deeper, more complex sorrow. I wasn't just mourning my husband. I was mourning the family I thought I had. The betrayal was a second death, in some ways more painful than the first, because it was born of malice, not chance. There were days I didn't leave the house, days where the silence was filled not just with missing David, but with replaying every interaction with Mark and Lisa, searching for clues I had missed. My therapist, Dr. Evans, helped me navigate the dual layers of loss. You are not just grieving a person, she said gently during one session. You are grieving a narrative. The story of your life, which included a trustworthy family, has been proven false. That requires its own mourning process. She encouraged me to separate the two griefs, to allow myself to miss David with the full, pure intensity of my love, and to process the betrayal as a separate, painful event. This was when I began the conscious, difficult work of establishing boundaries. It started with my parents. I loved them, but their instinct was still to smooth things over, to forgive and forget for the sake of family unity. I had to be firm. I cannot have a relationship with Mark and Lisa, I told them, my voice soft but unyielding. And if you choose to maintain one with them, that is your decision. But I will not hear about them. I will not see them at holidays. They are dead to me. It was a brutal thing to say, but it was necessary for my survival. My mother cried, but for the first time, she didn't argue. She was beginning to understand that my well-being was not negotiable. Honoring David's true legacy became my mission. The man they had tried to paint as an unfaithful liar was the same man who had loved me so fiercely that he had built a fortress of documents to protect me. I used a portion of the life insurance money, the money they had tried to steal, to establish the David Mitchell Foundation for Architectural Preservation. It funded grants for young architects and restoration projects for historical buildings, things David had been passionate about. It was a way to channel my love and my loss into something that would perpetuate his true spirit. One of creation, not destruction. One afternoon, I was in the garden, pulling weeds, a task David had always loved. I felt a familiar wave of sadness, but for the first time, it wasn't accompanied by the crushing weight of despair. Instead, it was accompanied by a memory of him laughing, covered in dirt, proudly showing me a tomato he'd grown. In that moment, I realized something crucial. The vulnerability I had felt after his death, the utter shattering of my world, had not been a weakness. It had been a cracking open. And from those cracks, a new strength was emerging. I had been vulnerable, and I had been attacked, but I had also fought back. I had discovered resources within myself, a sharp eye, a dogged persistence, a core of steel that I never knew I possessed. My vulnerability had not made me a victim. It had forced me to become a warrior. David's love had been my armor, but my own strength had been the sword. The family fractures would not fully heal. Some relationships were lost forever, but the ones that remained were stronger, built on a new foundation of honesty and respect. I had learned that family is not a free pass for toxicity. True family are the people who stand by you when you uphold the truth, even when it's messy and painful. It was a painful lesson, but a vital one. The aftermath was not about returning to the way things were. It was about building something new, something sturdier, from the rubble they had left behind. The first anniversary of David's death arrived not as a cliff edge, but as a steep hill I had already begun to climb. The sharp, jagged pain of the early months had softened into a persistent, manageable ache, a presence I had learned to carry with me, rather than one that crushed me. My healing process was not linear. There were still days when a song on the radio or the scent of his favorite coffee would stop me in my tracks, bringing tears to my eyes. But now the tears were followed by a deep, grateful breath. I was learning to miss him without falling apart. The David Mitchell Foundation for Architectural Preservation became the central project of my life. What started as an idea born of defiance grew into a thriving organization. We funded our first project, the restoration of a dilapidated Art Deco theater in a struggling part of the city, a cause David would have championed. Attending the planning meetings, working with the young, idealistic architects, I felt a sense of purpose I hadn't felt since before his death. I wasn't just preserving buildings. I was preserving a piece of his soul, his passion for beauty and structure. In the foundation's success, I found a way to channel my grief into something generative, something that would outlive me. It was the ultimate honor to his true will. Not the forged document of greed, but the authentic will of his heart. My own life began to slowly, cautiously expand again. I started accepting dinner invitations from friends. I reopened my interior design studio, taking on a few select clients. The work was different now. My style had evolved. I found myself drawn to warmer colors, more textured fabrics, creating spaces that felt not just beautiful, but resilient and safe. My own home underwent a subtle transformation. I didn't erase David. His favorite chair remained by the fireplace. His sketches still hung on the wall. But I added my own marks. I painted the study a warm terracotta, a color he would have thought too bold, but that filled me with energy. I was learning to weave my future into the tapestry of our past. The lessons from the ordeal were etched into me. I learned that trust is precious and must be earned continuously, not assumed through blood or history. I learned that documentation is not a sign of paranoia, but an act of profound love and responsibility. I had copies of everything now. Financial records, medical documents, important correspondence, all neatly organized and stored securely. It was my own disaster preparation kit, a practice I knew David would have approved of. I had learned to protect the life I was rebuilding with the same fierce clarity he had used to protect me. About 18 months after David's death, I met someone. His name was Ben, a history professor I was introduced to at a fundraiser for the foundation. He was kind, with a quiet intelligence and a gentle humor that put me at ease.